Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Seed to Harvest. Today, I'm super excited to have Nathan Beckord is the CEO of Foundersuite.com, a software platform for raising capital and managing investors. He's the host of Foundersuite's podcast, How I Raised It. He leads a life full of adventure, including climbing Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa, touring Vietnam, Cambodia, and Nicaragua on a motorcycle, and is a competitive sailor for a Canard team in San Francisco Bay. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here. I'm so excited.
Of course, of course. So I would love to dig in on where your passion for sailing and traveling first began.
So, traveling and sailing are related but slightly different. The traveling came from my dad. We grew up in a little mountain town in Colorado, and I remember tiny town. We were like he was a doctor. We were big fish in a little town. And one day over dinner, he came back from work and said, I think we're going to move to Saudi Arabia. And we're all just like, you know, jaws drop,
What?
or forks and knives drop on the plate and, dead silence. And he had got a job with Aramco, Arabian American Oil Company. And so we moved off to Saudi Arabia and then lived there for a little while. And then on the way back from there, stopped off at like Singapore and Philippines and Hong Kong and like all these amazing places around the world. And so that's where the love of traveling came from. And then he would take each of us 4 kids on big adventures. He took my sister to go visit the gorillas in Rwanda. He took me and we climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and did some other fun stuff. So that's where that came from. The sailing is a completely different story. And the story there is I was always in trouble in high school, like getting in various, never like juvenile detention so much, but a couple little
Getting
run-ins
close.
at the law here and there.
Cutting edges a little close there.
Yeah, just a few, had my mugshot taken once or twice. But my mom brought home a summer camp book, big thick book from whatever, Barnes and Noble or somewhere that had like 1,000 camps in there. And she's like, if you stay out of trouble for a whole year, you can pick any camp to go to next summer. I flip it open and there's a picture of like, hopefully this is PC enough to say, a couple girls in bikinis on a sailboat in the Virgin Islands. I'm like, I want to go to sailing camp, Mom. And, stayed out of trouble for a year and somehow got to go from Colorado to a sailing
Whoa.
camp and then just really got into sailing, like just fell in love with it because it's so, you're just one with nature. I could go on and on about sailing, but I won't.
Yeah, I know. I want to hear more about what are some of the lessons that you have learned from sailing that you've applied to your role as a CEO?
I think there's actually a lot. So my wife and I, in 2008, actually, like after working in Silicon Valley for a while, we decided let's just take off. And we bought a boat and sailed out the Golden Gate and down the coast of California, down into Mexico. And then we sailed across the Pacific to French Polynesia, like Tahiti and Moorea.
Whoa.
And really intense. I mean, lots of adventures there, but like a couple things, like I actually lean on that experience many times during startup life because, when you're out there sailing, especially when you're out in the middle of the ocean, you can't stop. You have to keep going no matter what, right? There's a squall,
Yeah.
there's a mini, I wouldn't say a tornado, but like a squall coming. You got to just kind of ride it out and deal with it. You got to batten down, hunker down the hatches and, kind of adjust your sails, adjust your course, kind of ride through it. And sometimes staying up for 24 hours, going through some heavy stuff and just going through that. Then you're back on land and starting a startup. And it's like, okay, I did that. Like I can handle anything, right? I mean, just
Yeah.
go through any experience. I'm sure people that have fought in the military and stuff like that have similar experiences. Like, I can do anything now. I lived through that. I can do anything, right? So that's one thing. And I think also just that sort of like, that's patient, slow. I mean, sailing is slow, right?
Mhm.
The bad joke is like it's the most expensive, most uncomfortable, slowest way to get around, right? And but it's also really fun. And I think startups are kind of the same way and sometimes too, right? You just got to have the patience, stick to it and, kind of ride out the squalls.
Yeah.
So,
When you think back to your trip sailing with your wife, what were some of the scariest moments that you encountered?
I mean, there were There were a few periods of pretty heavy weather, heavy wind where, it's like it's uncomfortable. You're like, these are big seas behind us. Like, I don't want to look around. If I look back, I'm gonna like freak myself out. So just, you know, hold steady at the helm kind of thing,
Yeah.
and keep going and go through it. And then there were other times like around the equator when you're making that crossing from Mexico to French Polynesia, you have to cross the equator and kind of go through the doldrums where there's
Hmm.
like no wind. And so you'll have days and days and days. I forget our longest stretch, maybe 4 or 5 days of no wind. And you don't want to like burn up
Whoa.
your gas because you don't have that much fuel on a sailboat, right? You have some, but
Yeah.
you can't power 5 days through the doldrums. So that's also a separate thing where you're just like flopping back and forth for days, and it's just like, okay, we gotta just hang in here. And and then a few days in, like you're like, oh, I think I felt a little breeze, I think I
A
felt a
little
little
tiny
puff.
breeze.
Yeah, and it's like, and then you're off. So those were, I guess, two things. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like when there's crazy seas, being really steady at the helm, and kind of similar lessons going through the doldrums of when nothing much is happening and you're kind of like waiting for something to happen. It's the same, like, steady at the helm and stay the course.
And knowing that eventually things will change, right? I mean,
Yeah.
no one has ever been in the doldrums for a year. I mean, right?
That's
It's like it
I wanna, like,
eventually
put that on
will.
my wall and, like, frame it. No one's
Yeah.
ever been stuck in the doldrums for a year.
I mean, I hope that's true. I think it's true.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure
yeah.
it's true. But it's just like it's like things will change. Things will, and I think I'm also kind of sailing like at another metaphor there. It's like, sometimes you're fighting the tide, right? Especially like in
Mhm.
San Francisco Bay, I went out sailing on Sunday and we had like a 3 knot flood tide. So 3 knots, and boats
Whoa.
only go 6 knots, right? So,
Yeah.
half of your speed, if you're going against that, is taken away and you're kind of sailing to go nowhere. But eventually the tides change and you slack and then it's ebb tide, right? Or whatever. I mean,
Whoa.
eventually things change. And sometimes I guess the lesson is just, even if you're going nowhere, if you're kind of just running to stay in place, that's good because eventually things will kind of turn back in your favor. I think that's a little applicable to like, the market today is getting a little tougher for startups, a little harder to raise capital. The macro environment, we keep hearing words about recession, but like you got to sometimes just ride out the recession, right? And then
Mhm.
you're ready for the next boom. So anyway.
Mm. Yeah, to go into that, like the startup insights, I'm curious, what insights have you discovered through your work with FounderSuite about the way that emerging managers and LPs work, seeing like the whole spectrum across it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think for founders raising money, they're like, okay, I'm going to go pitch all these funds, and I just need to talk to a lot of them, and understanding kind of what's on the other side of the table when you're talking to a VC. Like, they're human too, they're people too. They
Hmm.
want to go home and see their families at some point, and they're getting constantly pitched, and it's like actually a hard job. I think being a VC, I've only interned at VCs, I haven't been one myself, but like I think the job is hard, right? It's hard to find good companies. That's what they're to be a successful VC, they've got to find the good companies either before everyone else or get into the good companies, somehow better than other people can. And that's
Hmm.
really hard. And they're constantly getting hit by people pitching them day in, day out, morning, noon, and night, over LinkedIn, over email, over Twitter, right? You're just getting pitched constantly. And so I think that's a hard job. So I think, I guess the lesson is like recognizing what that's like to be on the other side of the table. And I think that's why it's so important to kind of stand out and be different and memorable as a founder, having something that's going to like stick in that investor's mind 6 days later, 10 days later, after they've seen another 50 pitches, right?
Hmm.
Um, I tell a lot of founders, like using our platform, like I'll look at their pitch and like, your pitch just, nothing grabs me, nothing's memorable, nothing like moves me in this, it's pretty dry and generic and boring, frankly.
What moves you? I'm curious, like, have there been patterns in that?
Yeah. Oh, God, it's hard to pinpoint. You sort of know it when you see it, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of good founders can tell a good story, right? They're like really good about um even on the opening slide, the opening minute or two during a pitch, going in and be like, imagine if XYZ happened, right? And they're kind of
Mhm.
pulling you along into a story, or they start with their own personal story. When I was 7, I was, forced out of Russia, da da da, and like they're weaving a story around why they're doing what they're doing. That
Mhm.
kind of pulls you in. Ideally, maybe you see yourself in the narrative. You've had that problem or issue
Mm.
along the way, some point, so you can see yourself in the plot line a little bit. I think those are what were so memorable, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's super interesting seeing like the narrative come together where it weaves together both personal aspects of your own story and then also trying to either Eric Bonnet Hustle Fund has a really great like pitch resource, but he talks about like some investors are attached more to logos and some are more attached to pathos. So it's like the logic or the emotions. I think the best story is drawn on both of those.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Logos or pathos, is that what it?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think that's true, right? You get them in with the heartstrings, and then maybe, get them on the logic side with your financials and your metrics, and then close them back on the heartstrings, right? Kind of bring it all
Yeah.
back around, like helping them envision this better world.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, like on the product side, like what's your approach to product development and finding new ways to support the like venture founder ecosystem at the earliest stages?
So we we kind of are a funny animal. We started off FounderSuite. When I launched FounderSuite, it was actually a bunch of tools, a whole bunch of tools for founders. We actually started with an investor CRM, a competitive tracker, a PR tool, an idea validation tool, like a bunch of different things, and realized that like people weren't using anything except the investor CRM. So we killed off all these products, focused in on the investor CRM as a way to manage a pipeline of investors, and then really we just listen really, really closely to patterns that our customers are asking us. Like, we put out the CRM out there and they're like, how do I populate it with investors? Okay, let's build an investor database. And then, they get the CRM, they're like, okay, I've just raised some money. I guess I need to cancel your service. I'm like, oh well, let's build investor update tools so you can stay
Mm-hmm.
on and communicate and update these investors. And then this is how it's happened with all our products. We have a pitch deck hosting, we have email follow-up tools, we have a data room we launched most recently, because
Hmm.
same thing, you're like, we're getting a lot of questions like, okay, I'm having great success with my fundraise, I'm getting some momentum with my pipeline in the CRM. Now I need to get into diligence stage. Do you have a data room? We're like,
Yeah.
nope. But I guess we should build it. It almost sounds like we're not thoughtful in this, but we actually are.
No, I feel like it's kind of like coming up with what the most pressing concerns are for your customers and focusing on the core of your product, like as you're iterating. And then when something becomes like undeniable that you have to add it to the product, then you invest the resources into building and iterating on that.
I like that word undeniable because that's totally
Yeah.
it. We're still small. We're like 15 people. We don't have huge resources. We have 7-person engineering team, right? We can't build everything. So it has to be that like 9 out of 10 people are saying, where's the damn data room? I'm like,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
exactly, exactly. When I was at WorkOS, we would get like a customer request for different things. We'd be like, oh, well, like think about incorporating that into our long-term product roadmap. But it had to be like at least 10 to 15 customers requesting something and being like, if I don't have this, I can't close this deal. This is like mission critical. Cause then you can really sort out like what your target customer demographic really needs and is willing to pay for. Cause I feel like if it's not undeniable, then it's easier to deny, like, paying for it, I would say.
I like that.
Um,
I'm writing that down. Undeniable. I like that. No, that's good.
so I'm curious, like, what I think specifically on the investor updates, I've written a monthly update for BGV for the past, year and a half now. We did our first close April of 2021. What advice would you have for both VCs and founders when it comes to managing their information and sending investor updates and, like, building trust that way?
First advice is just do it. I mean, I'm sure you know this, like, so many founders have good intentions. They just don't ever get around to doing
Hmm.
investor updates on a regular basis, or they do one and then they never do another one. I think so. I guess, make it a habit. And one little hack there I've mentioned to founders is like actually schedule it on your calendar. So it's like
Hmm.
the third week of every month at Friday at 2 o'clock, block off 2 hours and make that a recurring, event, recurring,
Yeah.
reoccurring. So it's always there. And so you just have dedicated time to do it because there's so many advantages to doing it. It's so valuable, helping build relationships, strengthen relationships, activating your investors, getting them to work for you, helping you solve challenges. I think other things, keeping it pretty digestible. What's it going to look
Hmm.
like on an iPhone or whatever,
Ooh,
Android,
that's a
right?
good, like, what's it gonna look like on an iPhone? Yeah, I feel like having the TLDR of like,
Hmm.
how are things going? Overall, you get this like list of things that have happened and changes in metrics, but I think getting a sense for like the overall field business of like, how are things going on a top level? Are you kind of like hitting your targets and feeling good? Are you in the doldrums? Are you full steam ahead and things are flying off the wheels as like you're keeping up with demand? I feel like that's been super helpful across our portfolio to get them because we like receive them as
Yeah.
it's cool.
Do you how long what's your desired length beyond just the summary? Like how much depth do you like to see?
It's funny because I got feedback from one of our investors that our updates are like really long. I'm a writer, so I suffer from that. I would say that like the investor updates that I really love reading are I think we invested in a company called Palette and they just do an incredible job of like they list the metrics, they list how the feeling, like how they're feeling, they talk about their team, and then they go in at the end and talk about like any key decisions that they made. So they're like, here's a key decision that we made. Here are the aspects that we thought around to make that decision. Here's what we think could happen on the short, medium, and long term view of the business. Like they made a product pivot that they're like, in the short term, this will stall our growth on our other product, but long term, we think it opens up the market. And it was really interesting because if you see those predictions, then you could compare the next month and be like, oh yeah, like what you predicted that would happen is happening, and I know why it's happening because you told me last month. So I don't know. I like reading long updates. I think that all investors are different in the amount of information, but I always find having a lot of context for where a business is helpful because like I want to go and brag about what the teams that we back are doing to our investors or folks who like ask me about it. And so having a lot of context for the business helps me do that and not feel like I'm gonna like run out of things to say. So yeah.
I like it. I wrote one last week for our investors. We
Yeah.
have an overview, which is 3 sentences, and
Hmm.
that's kind of like what you're saying. This is just the key talking points, the TLDR, and then recent highlights, and that's about 6 bullet points under recent highlights, challenges slash advice. There's a couple things we're dealing with, and then KPIs or metrics, and then looking ahead, what I'm kind of excited about next quarter, and then a couple images of us at South by Southwest and an image of our
Love that.
upcoming, like,
Some team photos.
some team photos and a picture of we're launching a kind of an enterprise version of Foundersuite onto its own separate brand. So I've got a sneak peek of that. So, and that's it. That's all it is. It's very short.
I love that. You run a podcast as well, so I'm curious, like, how that podcast has evolved your perspective as a CEO, and maybe if you could share, like, what surprised you most in your interviews, I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So the podcast is called How I Raised It, and it's just interviews with founders. Actually, I should get you on it. It's interviews with founders, like 230 founders, but then we've started interviewing some VCs and even a couple
Mhm.
fund to funds. So we're starting to interview like other people who raise capital. But what's been surprising is like I thought I knew everything about raising capital before starting this podcast because I had
Yeah.
worked in investment banking. I had spent quite a few years like helping companies raise capital and then launching a startup that builds tools for raising capital. I thought I knew it all. And then I get these people on the podcast and like, I've learned so much. Like I had no idea
Wait,
you
tell me
could.
more. What have you learned? I'm curious, like, also for the little tidbits. Like, we've had investors be like, "Here's the call to action you should end your, like, fundraising email with," and it's, like, crazy conversion, but I'm curious, like, what specific tactics have you seen work really well?
Not all now, to be clear, not all of this I would necessarily do myself
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but like I had one guy on there that was, everyone says cold email doesn't work, but he had a whole system, and I think he had some offshore folks doing like LinkedIn blasting. Like he would,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
and somehow it generated enough like intro calls, and his whole funnel. He was like, I don't remember the numbers, but it was like 3 or 5,000 LinkedIn invites and messaging led to
Whoa.
like 300 calls, led to like 30,
Yeah.
diligence
I think
meetings. Yeah.
that switch from being proactive to reactive, like as you said, like especially in venture where it's like very reactive, where you're receiving pitches all the time and like my inbox rarely goes to zero. I think carving out that time to be proactive and like send a couple cold emails or like look within your network and see who could be connected that might be interesting
Yep.
is a consistent like balancing challenge, but I found it to be quite helpful in our journey.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was one. Another guy had this whole system for, he was going to different angel groups, but he would first go look up the people on LinkedIn, reach out to like the lieutenants at the angel group, not the top people, kind of connect with them and say, hey, I want to get in with a group. And they say, oh, you really should go to Bob or Jennifer at the top. And then
Yeah.
he would reach out to Bob and say, oh, Sally recommended I contact you. And so it was a little bit of that
Wow.
gray area of like, oh boy, I don't know if I feel comfortable with that, but it was implying that like, I'm using silly names, but Sally had
Yeah.
referred the
No,
guy
but it's like a
in.
warm intro. I think that I feel like warm intros are super helpful because then like there's this whole motion of like banning warm intros in Silicon Valley, but I do think that like they're on like if I'm going out to fundraise, like getting a warm introduction to someone that could be a really strong connection
Yep.
has helped in like all of the instances where I've gotten one. And I feel like it's definitely useful to like find ways to like orchestrate warm intros.
What? So let's talk on that. One of
Yeah.
my favorite little hacks there is, and I've heard this from quite a few people on the show actually, where they didn't have a strong network in Silicon Valley or in the
Mhm.
venture world at all, and so they spent 6 months, sometimes a year, reaching out to other founders. They made a list of their desired investors, and then
Mhm.
figured out who they had invested in, and then reached out
Mhm.
to those founders, usually cold, and took them out to coffee, got on Zooms with them, and just built this whole network of founders who had been funded by the investors they wanted to get to,
Yeah.
which ultimately led to interest to those investors. It's like wow, and they're really methodical about it, like
Yeah.
really precise. I
Yeah,
thought it was
that's
really
super
cool.
cool. I think
Yeah.
like for any founder listening, that's really great advice for how to build a really thoughtful network because like the founders that you're talking with will have useful lessons for you and good connections, but there's less of a transactional aspect to the relationship because you're just like getting to know them and learning more about them and their business and like later on it parlays, but like you have a really thoughtful foundation around that.
If they like what
That's
you're
cool.
doing, and if you got a good pitch, if you're gonna make them look good by making an
Yeah.
intro, then it's a win-win, right? It's not a hard
Yeah, yeah,
sell.
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, Nathan, we're wrapping up our interview. I have one last question.
Yes.
What is the best piece of advice that others can use to set themselves up for career success?
Yeah, it's a bit of a riff off what we just talked about, and this is something I've found true in my own life and proven true over and over again with, I just got off a podcast with a founder, and it's building these relationships with the people you might need. Now, that sounds very transactional, but people you
Yeah.
might need like way in advance, 6 months, a year in advance. And like, I'll give his example. The guy's name is Bijou. He's got this startup called Radius Agent, but
Oh my God,
he's
I know
raised.
Bijou.
Oh, you know Bijou?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We like just went to like I saw him in Italy. I was there for a wedding and he was like part of the wedding party. He's
No
like one of my
way.
good
What a
friends.
small
Yeah.
world.
Yeah. That's
Hilarious.
so funny.
So he's very good about kind of what we talked about of like even a year before front when they're not raising money at all. He's getting intros, reaching out to sometimes cold, intros to 2 or 3 investors per month that he wants to get to know. And, he had a whole little format where, like, that first talk, he's like, hey, I just want to get to know you. I'm not raising money right now. I'm not pitching you for money. I just want to kind of start a relationship. And that first interaction you and I have, I kind of just talk about like the macro trends and my vision of the macro. And then the next one's a little bit, next time we have coffee or meet up or whatever, it's more about my vision for what I'm doing. And then the third time we meet up, it's like about the numbers, that's going on in my business. And by the time I'm actually ready to raise money, you've sort of got I've educated you about my industry, about my business, how it's going with my metrics. And so, when it's time to raise money, you're already kind of like pre-sold.
That's
And
so funny that Bijou is your example for that. But what a fun surprise to end on. Nathan, thank you so much for taking the time to come on today. So enjoyed our conversation. We have a lot to chat about offline as well. So I'll have to connect soon. And to those of you listening, thank you so much for joining. If you'd like to connect with Nathan, I'll drop his LinkedIn page and website in the show notes, and then tune in for new episodes every Monday.
perfect. Thanks so much for having me. It was fun. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for tuning in today to Seed to Harvest. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever your favorite podcast listening platform is. I'll be releasing new episodes weekly, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know on Twitter. That's Paige Finn, Paige and then Finn with 3 N's. Thanks, and see you again next week.